Ultros is about to arrive in what can quite simply be described as one of the most colourful and psychedelic metroidvania games you are ever likely to try out, and I will try my very best to keep the details here simple because Ultros is a very complicated game. My name is Beggles and I do indie game reviews and compilation videos. If that sounds like your cup of tea, consider following here and on Twitter. But moving on, let's jump into Ultros. Ultros falls into one of those games that doesn't quite give you a lot to go on from the start. You wake up in a weird location, what you will later find out is a sarcophagus, and slowly make your way through very colourful rooms, chatting to a few people along the way, and unlocking a simple sword. Luckily for us, there's a map that you gain access to pretty quickly, and having a look at pathways and sections that have not been explored quickly becomes your strategy, which I'm sure many people would be familiar with. I've got to say at the start I found the storyline pretty confusing, but once you make it past the first hour or so, you will start to learn the main idea is that there's a huge demon called the Ultros, and it seems that the end goal here is that people want this demon to be rebirthed, and you're probably going to be playing a pivotal role in the storyline. I'll come back to this a bit later. One of the first things I notice about Ultros is that it just feels a little more zoomed in than your traditional Metroidvania game. So you're larger, see less of the room, and it took me a moment or two to get used to it. It does control very well with the rolling feeling particularly smooth, and I found myself jump rolling all over the place. One interesting mechanic is the way enemies drop food for you to eat to regain health when you defeat them. Ultros rewards players who use completely different attacks on each enemy, which essentially gives you a reason not to just spam the same attack over and over in your fights. There are guards that can be broken with strong attacks, the ability to dodge and counter, and the mechanics are more sophisticated than I was expecting. There's also a skill tree which gives you access to different combos and aerial attacks. As you're spending a lot of time tracking your way through the map, I found that the movement was pretty good and becomes very good once you unlock a few of the extra abilities. Ultros also does a really good job of unlocking new pathways as you progress to avoid you having to do a lot of backtracking. Speaking of backtracking, the part I didn't mention about the storyline is that you're also stuck inside a time loop. This means after completing each part of the game, unlocking new abilities and defeating a boss that is acting as a seal to the demon Ultros, you will be sent back to the start with no sword, no double jump, and it can feel a bit deflating at first. Luckily, it doesn't take too long to get your gear back, and the way in which the levels and areas open up in each new time loop cycle makes it a really fun mechanic. I was sitting on the fence through the early parts of Ultros, but a few hours in, I'm pretty sold. You can't talk about Ultros without mentioning the art. Not only is this game colourful and bright, but there's a lot of detail and style that's been put into it, with reoccurring characters that start to become familiar and different areas that look similar but stand out for their different enemies, colour schemes and obstacles. I've played some pretty crazy games before where the colours are thrown at you almost as a sensory overload. This game doesn't fall into that. And once you've become accustomed to the different style of colours and art here, it's honestly one of the more pretty games that you will play. I did a review earlier in this year for a game called Anomaly Agent, and I said it has some of the best music I have heard in an indie game, and I'd put Ultros on level with that. There's nothing else to say here than this is a stunningly good looking game with an extreme amount of care and thought put into the way it looks and sounds. Boss fights are a big part of Ultros, and I found them slightly challenging without being rage-quittingly hard. It's pretty forgiving, allowing you to reload to just before the boss encounter upon death, and if you've got enough food, you can heal your way through fights pretty easily. The bigger fights do make you think about strategy, leading to the classic style of learning attack patterns and needing to recognize different cycles, which is pretty normal with Metroidvania games. When I first got into Ultros, I was thinking it might be just a little too confusing and complicated for my liking. Beyond the first hour though, I've got a lot of good words to say about it and can see this being a game that your hardcore Metroidvania fans are going to love. I give it 8.5 out of 10 and recommend you check it out for yourself when it releases this week.